distinguished delegates, I appear before you today on a sad and solemn occasion, the first meeting of the General Assembly since the murder of the Prime Minister of the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. History must be released by the new United Nations Command. That the first task of the United Nations is to allow the Congolese people to be ruled by a government of their own choice. The Congolese constitution provides a means by which such a government can be chosen. And we support the Kazenga government because it was chosen by this means and was the government that invited the United Nations to the Congo. The duty of the United Nations is not to force on the Congo this or that government, because the other states of the world think that any particular government should be a suitable one for the Congo. This is socialism. I therefore do not understand the emphasis which a number of powers lay on recognizing this or that government. Ultimately, it must be the Congolese people who choose their government and not the United Nations. What the United Nations must do is to see that the Congolese people have the opportunity to choose the government which they want. The present situation. My proposal is therefore that there should be, as soon as the United Nations have established law and order, a new general election conducted under United Nations supervision and under conditions where every political party can freely canvass for its policy without fear, without force, and without intimidation. Before, therefore, accepting a decision of the present Congolese parliament as an expression of the will of the nation, the United Nations must first satisfy itself that parliament is not meeting under duress and that the balance of political forces has not been changed by organized murder. Mr. President and distinguished delegates, what we need in the Congo is not a solution that is a compromise or seeks to reconcile the divergent views between East and West. What we want is a solution acceptable to the Congolese people and which ensures peace and stability in Africa and thus excludes the Cold War from the continent. As I have said many times before, we in Africa have a vested interest in peace. What is taking place in the Congo today could lead to a serious conflagration which would set us all ablaze and spare no one. Unless this unhappy and ominous trend is arrested at once, a major war will descend upon us again. If the proposals I am making succeed, we will be ensuring that the world is not only safe for ourselves in Africa, but also for the big powers. I believe that the plans I have put forward are entirely realistic and practical. Most people who have served or are serving with the United Nations in the Congo would agree with me. I believe that the African point of view at the United Nations headquarters in New York has now some influence in that the Secretary General is making use of the advisory committee, but this is not enough. The African viewpoint should also be much more fully represented at the United Nations headquarters in Dopetville, in both the civil and the military spheres. United Nations headquarters in Libreville is divided into several military sections. On the civil staff, I would like to see many more experienced Africans in position of authority than it is at present the case. On the military side, my feelings are the same. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, action in the Congo is urgent. Up till now, the United Nations has failed in the Congo. It entered the Republic to restore law and order. Yet today, mutinous troops who roam the country, committing atrocities, rapine, murder, and all forms of indiscriminate killings. There is virtual civil war. The United Nations entered the Congo with a specific mandate to preserve the unity of the Republic. Instead, under the very shadow of the United Nations, the Katanga province is being, in practice, detached from the rest of the state and converted into a new type of Belgian colony. The first task of the United Nations was to secure the withdrawal of Belgian forces. Instead, Belgium has been allowed to establish what amounts, in fact, to a military dictatorship in Katanga. Belgian military equipment is supplied to rebels and separate forces before the eyes of the United Nations forces, who are powerless to intervene. United Nations presence in the Congo had to be based upon the solid political foundation of the consent of the Congolese people. This consent could only be expressed by the Congolese people through their elected representative, assembled in Parliament, and through the government, which had been appointed by Parliament in accordance with the Constitution of the Congo. Instead, the United Nations stood by passively while Parliament was prevented from meeting by Mobutu in command of a band of mutineers. While in theory, the United Nations acknowledged the Constitution of the Congo Republic, it in fact collaborated with the very forces which denied its legitimacy. Distinguished delegates will recall that Mobutu claimed to have deposed both President Kasavubu and the government of Patrice Lumumba, and to have deposed all government but his own. He had no possible claim to exercise any legal authority. Nevertheless, the United Nations authorities in Libreville collaborated with his so-called College of Commissioners, which he had set up, and thus gave the mutineers not only authority, but also a ready supply of cash from the resources of the Congo. This the rebels employed in furthering their mutiny and in attempting to consolidate their position in opposition both to the President and to the Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba. That such action what has happened to the principle so widely canvassed in theory that all aid should be channeled through the United Nations. The distinguished delegates of the United States, Mr. Adlai Stevenson, some little time ago, wrote an article in the London Sunday Times in which he pointed out the absolute madness of partitioning Africa economically along the pattern established in Europe. What indeed should the Congo be economically attached to the common market countries? Only one valid reason for this exists: the maintenance of Belgium's financial interest. Yet all this is going on under the shadow of the United Nations, and apparently with the active participation of the United Nations experts. There is a special voluntary United Nations fund for restoring the Congo's economic life and carrying on its public services. the use to which this fund has been put has been a matter of great concern to us of the independent African states. It is now over 3 months ago since I wrote to the Secretary General